The previous video, the Shroud of Turin, Proof of Authenticity Beyond Reasonable Doubt, covered several lines of evidence that together make a compelling case in favour of the shroud being the true burial cloth of Jesus Christ. However, all this evidence has been completely overshadowed by the radiocarbon dating of the shroud in 1988. This single scientific test achieved more publicity than all the other research combined, and to the dismay of Christians around the world, the test concluded that the cloth dated from the period 1260 AD to 1390 AD. Professor Hall of Oxford University, who announced the result, made his views very clear, saying, "There was a multi-million-pound business in making forgeries during the 14th century. Someone just got a bit of linen, faked it up, and flogged it." This test was a defining moment in the debate over the shroud's authenticity, but concerns quickly grew amongst some scientists. There were claims that the radiocarbon dating project had fallen short of acceptable scientific standards in almost every part of the process, including initial planning, removal of the sample, running the radiocarbon tests, and result analysis and reporting. Indeed, art historian Thomas de Wesselo would later state that the carbon dating of the shroud will probably go down in history as one of the greatest fiascos in the history of science. On the face of it, this is an outrageous claim, but I'll cover some of the concerns raised by this test shortly, so you can decide whether this harsh assessment was justified. In the meantime, in case you don't know how radiocarbon dating works, here's a short explanation. Most carbon atoms have a nucleus containing 6 protons and 6 neutrons, which adds up to 12 particles, and so scientists refer to it as carbon-12. High in the atmosphere, cosmic rays from the sun are constantly colliding with molecules, knocking protons off some atoms and neutrons off others. When one of these neutrons strikes a nitrogen atom, which has 7 protons and 7 neutrons, it can dislodge a proton to create a carbon atom with 6 protons and 8 neutrons. This adds up to 14 particles, so it's referred to as carbon-14. Carbon-14 behaves just like a carbon-12 atom. For example, it can combine with oxygen to form carbon dioxide, but it has one key difference: it's unstable. Every 5,730 years, half of these atoms decay to form nitrogen. After another 5,730 years, half the remaining carbon-14 atoms will have also decayed, and so on. Carbon is present in the cells of every living thing, and all plants, including flax, which was used to make the linen for the shroud, get their carbon from the atmosphere by absorbing carbon dioxide. When flax is harvested to be made into linen, it stops absorbing carbon dioxide, and so the number of carbon-14 atoms gradually reduces through decay, whilst the number of stable carbon-12 atoms stays the same. Radiocarbon laboratories are able to count the relative numbers of carbon-14 and carbon-12 atoms using highly complex and sensitive equipment, and this is how they work out the age of historical items such as an ancient piece of cloth. So let's return to the 1988 radiocarbon test of the shroud. This test was in fact first proposed 4 years earlier by the Shroud of Turin research project team, commonly abbreviated to STURP, whose scientists had already studied the shroud in great detail in 1978. They submitted a proposal to the Vatican requesting 26 new tests on the shroud, one of which was a radiocarbon dating test. The proposal was approved by Cardinal Ratzinger, who later became Pope Benedict XVI, and in the months that followed, several planning meetings took place. These involved representatives from the Vatican, as well as experts from various fields including archaeology and textiles, scientists from the Shroud of Turin project, and several radiocarbon dating laboratories. They agreed a protocol for conducting the radiocarbon test, which included the following key principles. 7 laboratories would be involved. 2 different methods of carbon dating would be used, a widely used and proven technique and a new method which was less well established but had the advantage of needing much smaller samples. The tests would be supervised and coordinated by Dr. Michael Tite of the British Museum. Shroud samples would be taken from at least 3 different areas of the cloth. The Shroud of Turin project scientists, who had previously studied the shroud in detail, would select and cut the sample. Each of the laboratories would test fragments of the shroud plus 2 control samples. The test supervisor would know the age of these control samples, and so by getting the laboratories to test these alongside the shroud fragments, he could check the accuracy of the dating process being used in each laboratory. A blind test approach would be adopted. The samples to be dated would be indistinguishable from each other, so that the laboratories running the tests wouldn't know which was the shroud and which were the controls. The laboratories would maintain strict secrecy, informing no one of the results except those authorised by the British Museum, and the laboratories would conduct tests concurrently and without exchanging information. 3 institutions, the British Museum, the Meteorological Institute of Turin, and the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, would statistically analyse the experimental results, and finally, after the results had been analysed, these organisations will meet with the radiocarbon labs to agree the final result for communication to the Vatican. They may have reached agreement on these protocols, but this wasn't a harmonious group. The radiocarbon team seemed to regard any other scientific test as irrelevant and was seen by the other scientists as being motivated mainly by the publicity and funding opportunities that dating this renowned cloth would bring to their laboratories. The radiocarbon scientists were also suspicious of the Shroud of Turin project scientists, who they saw as religious zealots, perhaps due to their previous work on the shroud having pointed towards its authenticity. Indeed, Harry Gove, the radiocarbon group's unofficial spokesman, was determined to exclude them completely, claiming that, almost without exception, they were people who honestly believe it's Christ's shroud. It's a well-known fact that scientists can produce whatever result they want. If you believe that passionately in something, you can steer the results. My God, we've all been guilty of that. Now that's quite an admission. After some persistent and effective lobbying, Harry Gove and his colleagues got their way. The only test to be taken forward was the radiocarbon test, and in addition to dropping the other studies proposed by the Shroud of Turin project team, it was decided that they wouldn't even be involved in choosing or removing the test samples. A strange decision, given that these very scientists were uniquely qualified for this role, having studied every inch of the shroud in detail. Very quickly, other key aspects of the agreed test protocol fell by the wayside. Vatican officials decided to allow only one area to be sampled, despite warnings from the radiocarbon scientists and archaeologists that a minimum of 3 areas must be sampled if the result is to be trusted. Then in May 1987 came the announcement that only 3 laboratories, those based in Arizona, Oxford and Zurich, would perform the test, all using the newer and less established method of carbon dating. To the disappointment and anger of Harry Gove, his Rochester laboratory was one of the 4 which would no longer be involved. This was quite an ironic twist, given he'd played a leading role in getting the Shroud of Turin project scientists removed from the process. So the test hadn't yet begun, and already 4 key components of the agreed protocol had been abandoned. The process of taking the sample from the shroud created even more controversy. The removal took place in Turin Cathedral on the 21st of April 1988 in the presence of test supervisor Michael Tite, a delegation from the Catholic Church headed by Cardinal Balestrero, representatives from the 3 carbon dating laboratories, photographers and a camera crew who were there to document all stages of the operation. Also present were 2 textile specialists whose role was to choose the best place to take the sample from, but their credibility as experts was tainted somewhat when one of them pointed to the blood stain caused by the wound in the side and asked, What's that large brown patch? Eventually they chose to cut a fragment from a corner which had been frequently handled and stretched over the years during expositions of the Shroud. It was also close to where the cloth had been burnt away during a fire in 1532 AD, and it had been stained when the water used to put out that fire left deposits of dust, blood and other contaminants on that area of the cloth. In fact, it's hard to imagine how they could have chosen a less suitable place for radiocarbon dating. Three pieces of the removed fragment, one for each laboratory, were then cut out and weighed, but as one was smaller than the other two, an extra piece was shaved off to ensure that each laboratory received about 50 milligrams of material. The leftover piece was retained and kept in reserve. 3 fragments were also cut from each of the control samples, but these had an orthogonal weave pattern that was very different to the herringbone pattern of the Shroud sample. Rather than unravel them all so that no one running the test was aware of this distinction, these fabrics were left whole, making it easy to distinguish the Shroud sample from the controls. This meant that the protocol requiring blind test procedures had effectively been abandoned. Cardinal Balestrero, his scientific advisor Professor Luigi Ganella, and Michael Tite then moved into an adjacent room where the Shroud fragments and the control samples brought by Tite were wrapped in foil and placed in specially prepared and numbered metal cylinders, which were to be given to each of the 3 laboratories. Although it had been agreed in a meeting earlier that year that they would film all aspects of the sampling operation, this critical part of the process was not filmed, which meant that there was no video record to verify which samples had been placed into each container. And there was another surprise when a third control sample that wasn't part of the agreed plan was suddenly and inexplicably introduced by Tite. He'd made his own arrangement for some threads from the 13th century cope of Saint Louis of Anjou to be dated by the 3 laboratories alongside their other tests. No one else had been expecting this late intervention, and so no cylinders had been prepared. Instead, these were placed into 3 envelopes. The absence of a video record showing the samples being placed into the cylinders, combined with this last-minute unplanned introduction of a fabric whose date just happened to coincide with the eventual result of the Shroud dating, left the test wide open to claims that the Shroud sample had been switched. Now this almost certainly didn't happen, but it is hard to explain why yet another protocol was ignored and why they didn't allow filming of the samples being placed into cylinders. Finally, the Shroud samples plus the control samples were handed to the representatives of the laboratories. However, the receipt that they were asked to sign showed the dates of the control samples. Now, the main reason for having these control samples was to check that the laboratories were given accurate results. By letting them know in advance how old they were, they had effectively undermined the value of these tests. Attention now turned to the laboratories where the testing was to take place. Before beginning their tests, they reweighed the samples they had been given. The Shroud fragment given to Zurich weighed 52.8 milligrams, which matched one of the weights seen in Turin, but Oxford's fragment weighed 50 milligrams, which didn't match any. And there was even more confusion in Arizona, which received the 2-piece sample that had weighed 53.7 milligrams in Turin. However, when they reweighed it, it was only 52.8 milligrams, not 53.7, and the label on the cylinder showed an entirely different weight, 53.8 milligrams. It didn't bode well that the team responsible for the most high-profile radiocarbon dating project ever undertaken couldn't reliably track the sample weights. And of course, these weight discrepancies further reinforced the suspicions of anyone who believed that the samples may have been switched. As we've seen, the heads of these laboratories had agreed to run the tests simultaneously and had committed to maintain a strict code of secrecy to avoid any leaking of the results, not even sharing information about the tests between them. Indeed, the test results were not to be revealed to anyone apart from Dr. Michael Tite of the British Museum and the Colonetti Institute of Turin for statistical analysis. The laboratories initially seemed to be holding firm to this commitment. They certainly turned down requests from the Vatican, the owners of the Shroud, to allow a church representative to observe one of the tests. But not everyone was turned away. During the month of May, Harry Gove was able to persuade the Arizona laboratory to allow him to attend their tests on condition that he signed an agreement that he would not mention the results to anyone. The Zurich laboratory went even further, and during June, they opened their doors to an entire BBC crew who wanted to film the process for a TV documentary. It was later revealed that Harry Gove and his assistant had wagered a pair of cowboy boots on the result. His assistant was sure that the Shroud would prove to be from the time of Jesus, whilst Gove was betting on it given a medieval date. As soon as the tests revealed a result in line with Gove's prediction, he completely ignored the non-disclosure agreement he'd only just signed and immediately contacted his assistant to claim his prize. The Oxford laboratory began their testing in July, and by August, English newspapers had already started to leak the results, even before they had been communicated to the church. 2 weeks before the results were unveiled, a book went into print entitled The Shroud Unmasked and subtitled Discovery of the Greatest Forgery of All Time. Professor Hall, who was responsible for the Oxford laboratory, didn't seem at all embarrassed by these leaks, stating, "Frankly, I think it was a hopeless prospect to keep the results secret. You couldn't with the best will in the world." This is an astonishing statement, but it's clear that none of the laboratories made a serious attempt to maintain secrecy. This was a clear breach of yet another test principle. And also, despite having agreed that all three laboratories would run the tests concurrently, the Zurich laboratory started their testing in June, a month after Arizona, and Oxford didn't begin theirs until July, 2 months later. Altogether, this was a sad episode which left a huge question mark against the integrity of these leading radiocarbon scientists. So far, we've covered a number of protocol violations and substandard test procedures which resulted from a combination of poor management and decision-making, bad judgment by so-called experts, sloppy record-keeping, and a complete disregard for the need to keep commitments and uphold prior agreements. However, when we look closely at the failings in the next phase of this project, the statistical analysis of the results, we find a different root cause entirely. It appears that this analysis was deliberately and systematically manipulated to support a particular conclusion. Even before any results had been published, there was a reason for serious concern, for in spite of having agreed that all the laboratory test results would be given to both the British Museum and the Colonetti Institute of Turin for statistical analysis, the Colonetti was denied access to this data. The statistical analysis was therefore completed by Tite's British Museum statisticians without the Colonetti's involvement, a clear breach of one of the three remaining key test principles. This unease became more widespread once the official test report was finally published in February 1989. But before we look at the reasons for this growing concern, here's a brief overview of how test results such as these are typically analysed and presented. When making simple measurements, such as finding the height of a door, we would expect any good tape measure to give exactly the same result every time. If, however, we wanted to find the age of an ancient door by carbon dating small fragments of its wood, this is a much more complex measurement which doesn't give the same level of precision, And so when we repeat that test again and again, rather than getting the same measurement every time, we expect to see different values, hopefully within close range of each other. Statistical analysis is a science which allows researchers to make sense of scattered values by mathematically combining them. It can therefore help to make sense of radiocarbon dating test results, but what it can't do is give an exact, definitive age. It can, however, find the most likely or mean age, along with a margin of error. This can be shown visually as a bell-shaped curve, which scientists call a probability distribution. The value which corresponds with the peak of the curve is the most likely age, and as the curve gets lower, the corresponding age values become less likely. If all the measurements are closely grouped, the resulting curve is high and narrow, reflecting a tight range of possible values. But if the measurements are widely scattered, it flattens out and becomes wider, indicating less certainty in the result. Now, for the Turin Shroud radiocarbon dating project, each of the 3 laboratories performed multiple measurements on 4 different fabrics, the 3 control samples and the Shroud fragments. These were published in the final test report. Now let's look at the bell curves for these results, starting with the 3 control samples. The important thing to notice is that these curves have a large degree of overlap, which indicates that their measurements agree. The results were also close to the known age of each of these samples, an outcome which would have been even more impressive if they hadn't already been given these details before running their tests. Now look at the results for the Shroud. We know that they would eventually announce that the Shroud was medieval in origin, dating to 1260 to 1390 AD, but when you look at the 3 curves, they don't overlap to the same extent. Indeed, if we take away the Zurich test, we can see very little overlap at all between the Oxford and the Arizona curves. In fact, you could assume they were testing different cloths entirely if you didn't already know they came from the same source. Now it's worth comparing each laboratory's results with where the fragments tested came from. The age given by the Arizona test was lower than the Zurich result, and Oxford had the oldest result of the 3. Intriguingly, it seems that the results get older as we move along the cloth. The statistical analysis of these results also appeared to indicate that the ages of the Shroud samples tested were not the same. The British Museum statisticians calculated the overall mean age from the results given by the laboratories, as well as a value known as the significance level, which is a measure of how reliable the results are, given that the laboratories should be getting similar results for each of these 4 sets of tests. A high significance level value is a good sign, but low values indicate that we should have less confidence in the outcome. For the 3 control samples, this value is quite high, but when we look at the Shroud result, we see it's only 5%. In other words, we see there was only a 5% chance, a small 1 in 20 chance, that the results are reliable. Now it's very interesting that they achieved a significance level of 5%, because any value below that would cause most statisticians to automatically reject these tests as they wouldn't feel that they could trust the results. Clearly the dating of the Shroud only just avoided this outcome, but in spite of this close shave, Michael Tite and his team concluded that these tests had successfully established the age of the Shroud. In other words, they chose to back a conclusion that according to their own statistics had only a 1 in 20 chance of being correct. This seems an extraordinary decision to have taken, until we remember that for the radiocarbon laboratories, this prestigious project was an opportunity to raise their profile and potentially attract more funding. Clearly that opportunity would have been lost if they'd reported a failure to obtain an acceptable result. You might be thinking how lucky it was that they managed by a whisker to achieve the 5% significance level threshold that avoided this outcome. Well, it turns out luck had nothing to do with it. It's possible to recalculate the significance level for the Shroud from the published results from the 3 laboratories. When we do this, we find the correct figure to be 4.176%, below the significance level of 5%, but this number was rounded up to 5. Now, you don't need to be a graduate in statistics to know that this number should have been rounded to 4, not 5. Indeed, children in UK primary schools are taught how to round numbers. In a list of numbers such as this one, any number that is greater than 4.5 rounds up to 5, and anything less than 4.5 rounds down to 4. Now, such a basic error can't have been a mistake. After all, the Shroud of Turin test report was signed off by 21 scientists representing the British Museum and the radiocarbon laboratories, so it's hard to avoid the suspicion that they wanted to cover up the fact that the tests failed to achieve the critical 5% significance level threshold. Close inspection of the published test report revealed another mistake which falsely inflated this value. The 3 laboratories each ran several tests of the Shroud fabric, and these results were combined to give the age and margin of error results reported by each of the laboratories. These individual test results were shown in the report, so it's possible to redo the calculations to check the laboratories had reported their results correctly. This check confirmed the Oxford and Zurich results, but revealed that the margin of error on the Arizona date was wrong. It should be much smaller. No explanation was given for this apparently incorrect value, and this troubled many scientists, especially when their requests to see the actual test data obtained by the laboratories were repeatedly refused. A Belgian chemist named Remy van Hilst was persistent in trying to get to the bottom of this discrepancy, and in 1997, some 8 years after the radiocarbon test report had been published, he discovered that Arizona had actually provided 8 radiocarbon test results for the Shroud, not 4 as claimed in the published test report. Dr. Morwen Lees, the lead British Museum statistician, had written to Arizona asking them to reduce the 8 results to 4 by merging 4 different pairs of values. There was no mention at all of this merging of results in the published test report, which clearly stated that Arizona had provided only 4 results, something that we now know was completely untrue. So now that we have these 8 test values, we can recalculate what the overall result for the Arizona laboratory should have been, and it now shows an age of 645 years with an error of plus or minus 17 years. This is a much lower margin of error and reduces the spread of possible values for the Arizona test, making it appear even less likely that their fragment was the same age as the one dated in Oxford. It also changes the significance level value, and instead of being 4.176, it's now 1.359%, way below the 5% threshold needed to allow this to be considered an acceptable set of tests. This discovery of previously hidden test results led to demands that the British Museum release all the raw data given to them by the laboratories. These demands were repeatedly refused until 2017, when a legal request for their release under the Freedom of Information Act forced the British Museum to make this information available. This new information revealed that all of the laboratories had performed more dating tests on the Shroud than had been reported in the official radiocarbon test report. A fresh analysis of this newly revealed data confirmed once again that the tests didn't provide a statistically reliable date for the Shroud. So let's summarise these findings. The British Museum's statisticians had managed to avoid having the Shroud dating automatically declared void by A. Not disclosing the true test results, B. Falsely inflating the margin of error in the date given by Arizona, and C. Rounding the already distorted significance level value from 4.176 up to 5 instead of down to 4. And despite this clear manipulation of the test outcome, 21 scientists were still prepared to sign off the final report, which claimed the test to be conclusive proof that the shroud dated from the period 1260 to 1390 AD. This is quite a shocking deception, but it's worth remembering the statement made by Harry Gove. It's a well-known fact that scientists can produce whatever result they want. If you believe that passionately in something, you can steer the results. My God, we've all been guilty of that. Now, Harry Gove might dismiss this kind of behaviour as steering the results, but if accountants are found to use similar tactics when preparing corporate financial statements, they're usually charged with criminal fraud. As we've seen, there were clearly major flaws at every stage of the Shroud dating project, and especially in the way in which the results have been interpreted. It's no surprise that Thomas de Wesselo felt justified in describing it as one of the greatest fiascos in the history of science. Indeed, you might think his assessment was too generous. The radiocarbon test was, however, extremely successful in one respect. The announcement of the result on the 13th of October 1988 was a huge media event, and the claim that the shroud had been definitively proven to be a medieval forgery spread quickly around the world. Today, most people accept that claim, unaware that the test itself was deeply controversial, or that a host of other scientific evidence shows it to be wrong. And as far as the Oxford laboratory was concerned, this publicity led to the material rewards that they had hoped for. Shortly after the publication of the test report, they received £100,000 from ITV, a UK media organisation, and a donation of £1 million from 45 businessmen. This funding ensured that the laboratory would continue its work after the retirement of Professor Hall in 1989. And as if this project hadn't yet attracted enough controversy, the person chosen to replace Professor Hall? None other than Dr. Michael Tite. In the years since the radiocarbon dating, many of those who have studied the results have questioned why these tests should have failed to give a reliable date. After all, the fragments were all taken from a small piece cut from a corner of the shroud, so they came from the same source, and the fact that all the laboratories obtained similar dates from the control samples rules out the possibility of any of the labs having inaccurate testing equipment. Is it possible then that there was some form of contamination which affected the results? Various theories have been put forward over the years, but perhaps the most plausible was proposed by an American couple, Joseph Marino and Sue Benford. They weren't scientists, but they had a keen interest in the Turin shroud and had noticed something strange when examining photographs of the shroud that were taken in 1978. They discovered that the herringbone weave pattern that is consistent all over the cloth was misaligned in the area where the sample was taken. They believed this was due to a 16th century repair made following a fire which charred the shroud in several places. If correct, this would mean that the shroud fragments that were dated consisted of some 1st century linen, but highly contaminated with 16th century cotton that had been expertly dyed to match the colour of the shroud threads. And since the join of this repair was at an angle in the sample taken for radiocarbon testing, this would also explain why the age of the fragments tested by the 3 laboratories increased along the length of the sample. Photographs showing the misaligned weave were sent to 3 textile experts without letting them know that these were photos of the Turin shroud. All agreed that it looked to be a rewoven patch. Having had their theory confirmed, Sue Benford and Joseph Marino produced a paper outlining their findings, but the scientific community was quick to dismiss this work as ill-informed speculation by enthusiastic amateurs. Ray Rogers, a former Shroud of Turin project scientist, was particularly outraged.
I had given up on the Shroud, and this was about the same time that the lunatic fringe were coming up with an infinite number of ways the date could be wrong, and this was just the last straw. So I read their paper, and I thought, I've got the samples that can shoot that full of holes. The authentic radiocarbon sample that I got, these segments of yarn were cut from the middle of the radiocarbon sample, so there was no question about them. And when I looked at these samples from the radiocarbon area, there's no problem at all finding cotton in them.
He was now sure that Joseph Marino and Sue Benford were right, and he found other evidence that provided further support. The Shroud of Turin project team tests in 1978 had proved that the shroud was free of any dyes or pigments, but he discovered that some of the fibres in the radiocarbon fragments had been dyed.
You've got photomicrographs that demonstrate this very clearly. The cotton fibers from the radiocarbon sample are fairly heavily coated with the gum dye mordant, and some of the linen fibers don't show any of that at all. They look just as slick as anything, and it didn't stick to them. If you happen to hit a place where a yarn segment from the original shroud was spliced into the new reweave part, the splice very definitely shows the new yarn that was being put in and dyed to match. The only thing in the shroud that was dyed or stained was this radiocarbon area. So my hypothesis at the moment is that this was done on purpose to fool your eye. And when we went back and looked at the ultraviolet photographs, here is this area that's significantly darker. It doesn't fluoresce as much, and it's just this area that, around the raw sample and where the radiocarbon sample was cut. And if they had looked at any of the photographs that we had and studied the information we had as of 1978, they would have known that that was the worst possible place they could have taken a sample.
It's ironic that having set out to prove Benford and Marino's claims were false, Rogers' research confirmed that they were right. There was cotton contamination in the linen samples taken for carbon dating. He documented his findings in an academic paper which was peer-reviewed and accepted for publication in the Thermochemical Acta Journal in 2005. His paper didn't cast any doubt at all on the science of carbon dating, but instead showed that this radiocarbon result was wrong because the sample had been taken from a damaged corner. Sadly, this remarkable evidence received none of the glaring publicity given to the 1988 radiocarbon dating results. Instead, it sits in the shadows alongside the weight of evidence covered in my earlier video that proves that the shroud existed well before medieval times and that it directly connects to the time and place of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. Somehow, the contrived conclusion that the shroud is a medieval forgery based upon this deeply flawed radiocarbon test and its manipulated results has gained widespread acceptance. Of all the mysteries associated with this extraordinary relic, this travesty is perhaps the greatest enigma of all.